The barn door slammed open, and before Silas Boone could reach for the rifle propped against the stall, a woman he had never seen before shot upright from beneath a pile of horse blankets, her face white with terror, a black mourning band still knotted around her wrist and her husband's pocket watch clutched in one fist. There was no mistaking what she was, a widow and a frightened one. Somewhere past the frost-covered yard, hooves were already pounding frozen ground, 4 riders, closing fast. She grabbed his sleeve and whispered the words that would upend the rest of his life. "Call me your wife until they leave." He had 3 seconds to decide. Protect a stranger with a lie or hand her to whatever danger was riding straight for his gate. What would you have done? Would you risk your name, your land, maybe your life, for someone you'd known less than a minute? Stay with this one, because what Silas finds hidden in his own barn that morning will change everything he believes about solitude, courage, and love. And if stories like this keep you hooked to the very last frame, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, and tap like before we go any further. Now let's rewind to the quiet morning that led to that terrifying sound of hooves. Silas Boone had built a life designed to need no one. He rose before sunrise every day without fail, fed the horses before he fed himself, and mended fences alone rather than hire hands he'd have to make conversation with. His ranch was successful by any measure a neighbor could name. Strong stock, full barns, land that turned a steady profit year after year. And yet the house at its center sat cold and quiet, the kind of quiet that told you a man had long since stopped expecting anyone to walk through his door. Winter was coming early that year, earlier than the almanac promised, and Silas felt it in his bones the way he felt most things, privately, without a word of complaint to anyone. That morning, one mare wouldn't settle. She paced her stall, ears pinned flat, staring hard toward the far end of the barn like something back there had unsettled her rest. Silas took his time with her anyway, running a steady hand down her neck, murmuring low until her breathing slowed and her eyes softened. Only then did he turn toward whatever had spooked her, unhurried, the way he did everything. That was when he found her. A young widow asleep beneath a horse blanket, the mourning band on her wrist and a pocket watch pressed to her chest like she'd fallen asleep, holding onto the last piece of a man who no longer existed. She woke with a gasp, scrambling back against the wall. Before either of them could say a word, hoofbeats thundered into the yard outside. 4 riders, reining up hard, dust and frost kicking into the cold morning air. She grabbed his arm, her eyes wide and pleading, and whispered it again, faster this time, desperate. "Call me your wife until they leave." Silas didn't answer her. There wasn't time. He stepped out to meet the riders, pulling the barn door most of the way shut behind him, his pulse steady even as his mind raced through everything that could go wrong in the next 60 seconds. "Morning," the lead rider said, his eyes sweeping the property like he already doubted whatever he'd be told. "We're looking for a widow. Might have come through this way." "Haven't seen anyone," Silas said. "My wife isn't feeling well this morning. Kept me up half the night with it." The rider's eyes narrowed, dropping to the barn door, then to the gap where the wood had warped and left a sliver of daylight cutting through. Through that gap, just for an instant, the glint of a ring caught the light. "That's a wedding band in there," the rider said slowly, "and fresh mud on the hinge besides. Someone's been in and out recent." "Feeding the stock before sunup," Silas said, flat, unreadable, the kind of calm that came from a lifetime of saying little. Another rider leaned down from his saddle, studying Silas with open suspicion. "Didn't figure a man like you for married." Silas said nothing. Silence, he'd learned long ago, gave a liar far less to trip over than words ever did. The lead rider held his gaze a long moment, weighing the mud, the ring, the silence, all of it. Finally, he straightened in the saddle. "If you do see a widow passing through, Mr. Mercer would consider it a kindness to be told plain." "I'll remember that," Silas said. They rode off, but the lead rider turned back once before the trees swallowed them. "We'll be through this valley again before the week's out." When the dust finally settled, Silas walked back into the barn. Eleanor was sitting now, knees drawn to her chest, shaking so hard her teeth nearly chattered, the pocket watch still gripped tight in her fist. He crouched a respectful distance away, and asked the only question that mattered to him right then. "What's your name?" "Eleanor," she said, barely above a whisper. He didn't ask why the riders wanted her, why she'd been sleeping in his barn, or why she'd asked a total stranger to lie for her life. He simply nodded, like her name was answer enough for now, and rose to put on a pot of coffee. Eleanor stared at him, startled. Nobody in longer than she could remember had let her get away with saying so little. Over breakfast she gave him more anyway, slowly, in pieces she seemed almost afraid to say aloud. Her husband had died suddenly, without warning, and only days later, strange men had begun hunting for her across 3 counties. She didn't fully understand why, only that it terrified her enough to run with nothing but the clothes on her back, her husband's watch, and his old traveling trunk. When she finally said the name Gideon Mercer, something shifted behind Silas's eyes, hard and cold. "You know him," Eleanor said, watching his face. "Everyone in this territory knows him," Silas said. "Mercer doesn't chase a grieving widow across half the county out of sympathy. He chases money. Whatever he thinks you're carrying, he wants it badly enough to send 4 armed men after it." Eleanor's hands tightened around her cup until her knuckles paled. "I don't have anything left. I don't even have a home anymore." "You have a barn," Silas said, gentler than he meant to sound. "For now, that'll do." That night the sky turned the color of a bruise, and by morning the first blizzard of the season had buried the road in white silence. The pass closed within hours. Eleanor was stranded, not because Silas asked her to stay, but because the mountain itself had decided for both of them. "I have a spare room," he told her that evening, not quite meeting her eyes. "You'll freeze solid out there otherwise, and I won't have that on my conscience." "I won't stay for free," Eleanor said, chin lifting. "I'll work. I won't sit in someone's house being a burden to their charity." "I didn't offer charity," Silas said. "I wasn't asking for it," she answered. Something passed quietly between them in that exchange. Not romance yet, just the first thread of respect 2 proud, guarded people could weave without either one admitting out loud that it mattered. The weeks that followed changed the ranch more than either of them expected, or so it seemed at first glance. Eleanor found the breeding ledgers in disarray and fixed them without being asked twice. She repaired cracked tack with a needle, and thread most men wouldn't have bothered learning to use. She wrote 3 letters to buyers Silas had been too proud to chase down himself, and within a month, 2 wrote back with real offers on the table. Silas watched all of it happen and said little, but he noticed everything, filing away each small kindness the way he filed away danger. Small moments piled quietly on top of each other after that. Coffee shared in comfortable silence on cold mornings. Eleanor holding a newborn foal steady while Silas checked its legs, murmuring instructions she absorbed without complaint. The 2 of them repairing a fence line side by side, arguing good-naturedly over whether a post needed replacing or just resetting. One afternoon, a colt escaped its pen entirely and led them both on a laughing, breathless chase through half-frozen mud, and for the first time since his parents had passed, Silas Boone laughed until his ribs actually ached. "You're not what I expected when I woke up in your barn," Eleanor admitted one evening, watching the fire. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd turn me straight over to Mercer's men for whatever reward he's offering," she said quietly. "Most men would have and not thought twice." "I'm not most men," Silas said. She looked at him a long moment, something softening in her face. "No, you're really not." Midwinter, a traveling blacksmith passing through with news of the wider territory, changed everything again. Before he died, Eleanor's husband had reportedly mailed a package meant to prove exactly what Mercer had been doing for years: fraud, stolen land claims, forged contracts, quiet theft dressed up as respectable business. But the package, by every account, had never reached where it was supposed to go. Somewhere along the road, it had simply vanished. "Then it's gone," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. "Whatever proof he had, whatever he died trying to protect, it's gone, and I have nothing left to fight Mercer with." "Maybe," Silas said carefully, "or maybe your husband was smarter than the men chasing you give him credit for." Days later, Mercer's riders returned to the ranch. This time they didn't shout or threaten outright. They asked politely, almost gently, whether they might search the property themselves. "No," Silas said, just as calmly as they'd asked. That's your right, the lead writer said, tipping his hat with something close to mockery. For now. That evening, Eleanor sat by the fire, guilt written plainly across her face. I've brought danger into your home, Silas. You should let them look next time. You should let them take me and be done with all of this. No, Silas said, his voice low but unshakable. They brought it, not you. Don't you dare carry blame that was never yours to carry. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that Eleanor had felt truly protected, and she had to look away so he wouldn't see her eyes fill. Mercer's patience ran out fast after that night. Over the following weeks, the escalation came in waves designed to break Silas without Mercer ever showing his own hand directly. Horses were released from the north pasture in the dead of night, and Silas spent 6 freezing hours rounding them up alone, while Eleanor held a lantern against the dark, calling out each animal's name like she'd known them for years instead of months. Fences were cut along the eastern boundary, cattle scattering into land that wasn't his to lose. One night the barn itself nearly burned, a smell of coal oil in the hayloft, caught and stamped out only because Silas woke at the smell of smoke instead of sleeping through it like he was meant to. He's trying to bury you, Eleanor said one night, watching Silas wrap a burn on his forearm with trembling hands. Because of me. All of this is because of me. He's trying to bury both of us, Silas corrected her, which means we're doing something right enough to frighten him. How can you say that so calmly, after everything he's taken from you already? Because panicking never rebuilt a single fence, he said, and it's never once won a fight either. We hold. That's all we do. We hold. Buyers who'd agreed to purchase Silas's horses suddenly backed out one after another, spooked quietly by men who worked for Mercer paying them visits after dark. Silas said nothing about the losses, but Eleanor saw the toll it took in the tightness around his eyes each morning, in the way he stopped eating breakfast some days just to save the extra coin. Let me talk to the buyers, Eleanor said one night, standing so fast her chair scraped the floor. Let me write to them myself and tell them exactly what kind of man is threatening them. It's too dangerous. Mercer already knows you're here, Eleanor. Showing your name on a letter is handing him exactly what he wants. I'm done hiding, Silas, she said, voice shaking but steady. I've hidden in barns and behind borrowed names long enough. I'd rather fight and lose than hide and survive as somebody's secret. He studied her for a long moment, something like pride breaking through his caution. Then we fight together. Both our names on it, not just yours. The breakthrough came from the last place either of them expected. While repairing Eleanor's old stagecoach trunk, the one she'd carried with her since her husband's death, Silas noticed the wood sat too thick along one side. He pried at the false bottom until it gave way at last, and beneath it lay exactly what her husband had never managed to mail after all. He'd hidden it instead, planning to deliver the evidence himself before illness took that choice away from him forever. Contracts, personal letters, payment ledgers written in Mercer's own hand, coded records that, once carefully decoded, spelled out fraud so complete and so damning it would end him entirely. Eleanor stared at the papers, then at Silas, tears finally breaking free down her face. He was protecting it the whole time. He was protecting me the whole time, even after he was gone. He did his part, Silas said gently, taking her trembling hands in his. Now we finish it for him. Mercer arrived himself the following week, no longer polite, no longer patient, no longer pretending at civility. He rode in with the full weight of a man used to being obeyed without question and demanded Eleanor be handed over immediately, insisting whatever she claimed to have was forged, worthless, a desperate widow's lie meant to slander an honest man. She's not going anywhere, Silas said, standing squarely between them. Mercer laughed, low and cold, circling his horse a step closer. You'd lose everything for her. Your ranch, your name, every single thing you've spent your life building alone out here. I already found everything worth having, Silas said, and I've never once regretted a single day of it since. That was when the sound of more hooves reached them, not Mercer's men this time, but neighbors. Ranchers from up and down the valley, arriving one by one, then in 2s and 3s, until a dozen men and women stood quietly beside Silas Boone, without a single speech passing between them. No threats, no shouting, just presence, solid and unmoving. Mercer looked around at the ring of faces surrounding him, and, for the first time in years, understood that his grip on that valley had already slipped long before he'd noticed it going. Federal. Investigators arrived within days, drawn by evidence Silas had quietly sent ahead through a lawyer 3 counties over, the moment the trunk gave up its secret. Mercer's own ledgers, written in his own unmistakable hand, confirmed every fraud Eleanor's husband had died trying to expose to the world. His business partners abandoned him within the week. The empire he'd built on stolen land claims and forged signatures collapsed entirely, and justice came the way it rarely does in that hard territory, not through violence, but through the plain, undeniable weight of the truth itself. Spring returned slowly, the way it always does after a brutal winter, melting the roads open again at last. Eleanor packed her few belongings into the same stagecoach trunk that had once held the evidence that saved them both, and Silas loaded it onto the wagon without being asked twice. Neither said much at first. The silence between them had changed since that first frightened night in the barn. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything neither of them had said aloud yet. "I suppose you don't need to be my wife anymore," Silas finally said, not quite looking at her. Eleanor smiled, a sad, uncertain thing. "I never really was." He set her suitcase back down in the mud. "I know." She waited, heart hammering against her ribs. "I was hoping," Silas said quietly, "you'd become one anyway." Eleanor looked down at the wedding ring she still wore, the same ring a suspicious rider had once caught a glint of through a warped barn door, and for the first time since her husband's death, she slipped it off and held it in her open palm, not as a betrayal of what came before, but as a quiet goodbye to it. "Then I suppose," she said softly, "we'd better make it true." Weeks later, in a small church at the edge of the valley, Eleanor and Silas were married properly, surrounded by the same neighbors who'd once stood silently beside him against Mercer without needing to be asked twice. Afterward, an old rancher clapped Silas on the shoulder, grinning wide. "So, when exactly did the pretending end?" Silas looked at Eleanor, and for once didn't bother hiding his smile. "The pretending lasted one morning." Eleanor took his hand, threading her fingers through his like she'd been doing it for years instead of months. "The rest of it," she said, "was simply finding our way home." Some promises begin as nothing more than survival, a whispered plea between 2 strangers, said only to buy a few minutes of safety on a cold morning neither expected. Silas Boone opened a barn door that day, expecting nothing more than a spooked mare, and instead found a widow who would return warmth to a house he'd long ago mistaken for merely a place to sleep. Eleanor had whispered for a stranger to pretend, just for a little while, never once imagining that the smallest act of kindness offered back to her would become the truest, most permanent commitment either of them would ever make. If this story moved you, don't scroll away just yet. Subscribe for more Western romances like this one. Tell me in the comments which single moment hit you hardest, and give this video a like so more people find their way to Silas and Eleanor's story. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end.